All right, so we're back here for part 2. And now what we're going to do is actually solve some of these. So what happens when we're missing, say, a side length? Here's my variable. Now we want to figure out what that missing length is. So we're going to set up an equation. One thing you may notice about this problem is that, hey, that's a 30-degree angle, which means that this would be 60. This is a special right triangle. This is what we did last class. And if you remember in a 30, 60, 90, the ratio of the sides is 1 to the square root of 3 to 2. What we're missing is opposite 30. That's the short leg. That's this piece here. We know the hypotenuse is 8. So to go back from the hypotenuse to the short leg, divide by 2. So this answer is 4. So we actually know that the answer is 4. Okay, now, how would we do this with trigonometry? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to circle my angle. Okay, I'm actually going to write the steps down here. Step 1 is circle your angle and label the sides. Circle the angle and label the sides. Okay, so we're going to circle 30. That's the angle we're going to use. The opposite side would be x. The hypotenuse is across from 90. That's 8. That means the adjacent side is here. Now that side is blank. We're not trying to find that, and we're not going to use it because when you do the trig ratios, you only need 2 sides. You only need 2 sides. So this third side here, we're not going to use it. So actually, I'm just going to cross that out. But I like to label it anyway. Okay, so we circle the angle, we label the sides. Step 2 is we need to choose the correct ratio. Is it sine or cosine or tangent? Well, look at the way that we labeled. We need the opposite side. We're going to use the 8, which is the hypotenuse. So O and H that's a sine. Opposite divided by hypotenuse, that is the sine. So we're going to choose the ratio as sine. Step 3 is to write the equation. So the way we're going to write this is sine, angle measure. It's always the sine of an angle, the cosine of an angle, the tangent of an angle. Sine 30 degrees equals the ratio. Okay, now, so opposite divided by hypotenuse. The opposite is x, and the hypotenuse is 8. And now the last thing we do is we solve. Now here's what I'm going to do on this. I'm going to put this sine of 30 degrees over 1, which creates a proportion. Well, how do you solve a proportion? We cross multiply. So 1 times x is just x equals, remember this is an equation, so I put the equal sign. Now, the sine of 30 is going to multiply 8. I am going to always write this value in front. I'm going to put 8 times and then sine 30. It is not 30 times 8. This 30 is not by itself. Sine 30 is its own thing. It's together, okay? I'm not breaking that up. So I do not multiply 8 times 30. I'm multiplying 8 times the sine of 30. All right, now this is where you would need to take a calculator. And I'm going to take a graphing calculator here. If you have a graphing calculator, what you need to make sure of first of all is that if you go to mode, that you need to be in degree mode. Right now I'm in radians, which means I'm going to get every answer wrong unless I change it to degrees. So I'm going to do that. When you do sine, cosine, tangent, if I type the sign of a number, sine 60, remember, this is equal to some ratio. A ratio is a fraction, but it can be written as a decimal as well. And usually you're going to get long decimals. Sine of 60 is this, okay? That's what it's equal to. The tangent of 60 is going to be different. The cosine of 60 is going to be different. Oh, that actually works out nicely. That's 0.5. It's 1/2. If I do cosine 42, there's a decimal. Sine, 42 degrees. Tangent, 42 degrees. Okay, so if you're using a calculator, you're probably going to get these decimals here. Now, what I want to do in this problem is 8 times sine 30. If I just type sine 30, okay, so that's also 0.5, interesting. 8 times the sine of 30 equals 4, because it's 8 times 0.5, and that gives me 4. My answer is x equals 4. Now that shouldn't surprise us because we already knew that. Going back to the last lesson, we knew that this was going to be 4. This is half the hypotenuse. But now I'm showing you, hey, we can do this using trigonometry, using sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay, so let's do a couple more examples here. What you're going to find is that this seems confusing at first. Once you do a few problems, it's always going to be one of two pathways that you're going to take. I'm going to skip 3 for the moment. We're going to come back to that. Let's actually do 4 first. So number 4 says find x. All right, that's a length right there. Circle the angle, step 1. Label the sides. That's the opposite. X is the opposite. 10 is the adjacent because the hypotenuse is opposite 90. Now the hypotenuse is the blank side, so I'm going to cross that out because we're not going to use it. Okay? We don't need that. Now again, I'm going to write down so ka toa. I'm going to spell it out. If you write this down a few times, you'll have it memorized very, very quickly. So step 2, we need to choose the ratio we're going to use. Well, we have the opposite and we have the adjacent. So, nope. Ka, nope. Toa, opposite adjacent, winner, winner. All right, so here's how we write it. Tan, I'll come down here. The tangent of the angle, 42 degrees, equals the opposite length, which is x, over the adjacent, which is 10. I'm going to make this into a proportion by dividing by 1. When you divide by 1, you're not doing anything. You're just making it look a little different. Cross multiply, so 1 times x is x, equals 10 times tan 42. 10 times the tangent 42 degrees. You're going to be tempted to just go straight to a calculator here. I recommend that you always write it to here, then type it. You can't, if you put 42 times the tangent 10, you've just gotten the wrong answer. Okay, so what this will look like, 10 times the tangent 42 degrees. Okay, so 9.00. I'm usually going to round this to 1 decimal place, to the tenths. In this case, that would be 9.0. So x equals 9.0. And that's a good answer. Just to show you, what if I accidentally mixed up the numbers? What if I did 42 times the tangent of 10 degrees? Notice I get a different answer. So this is why, what I'm telling you, my recommendation, write this down, then type it. Because then you can type it exactly how you see it. Okay, let's come back up here to number 3. Find x. So first thing we'll do, we'll circle the angle. Let's label the sides. The opposite is blank. The hypotenuse is x. And the adjacent, ADJ, is 8. The blank side we're going to ignore. So what are we comparing now? We have adjacent hypotenuse. So, nope. Ka, adjacent hypotenuse, yes. So this is a cosine. So it's cosine 45 degrees equals. It's always sine of an angle, cosine of an angle, tangent of an angle. This is the position for the degree measure. Equals the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. Now this time the variable's on the bottom because it is the hypotenuse. And this is the thing about it. It's always going to be easier if the variable's here, but you have to make your ratio based on where the numbers and the variables are. Okay, so you can't force it. In this case, x is in the bottom. Well, to solve it, we're going to put this over 1. We're going to make a proportion. This time when we cross multiply, the x is multiplying not 45, but the cosine of 45. So I'm going to write x times cosine 45 degrees equals 1 times 8 is 8. Okay, so I'm not ready for the calculator yet because I don't have x by itself. So what I need to do is somehow move this cosine 45. Well, think of an equation that you're more familiar with. Let's say the equation, I'm just going to write it up here. 5 times x equals 20. How do we undo multiplication? Well, we divide. We divide by 5, and you get x equals your answer. This is the same thing. It looks different because you have cosine 45, but you're going to multiply that by x. How do we undo multiplication? Well, we divide both sides. Now, we're not dividing by 45. We're dividing by this whole thing, cosine 45 degrees. Cosine 45 degrees. Now, any value divided by itself is always 1. So I don't need to type this on the calculator. Whatever decimal that is, if I divide it by itself, I get 1. So what we have is x equals 8 divided by cosine 45. And now it's a calculator problem. Okay, so I'm going to take 8 divided by cosine 45 degrees. And we get 11.3. Now again, just to show you, what if I accidentally make a mistake and I don't put that division sign? What if I type 8 cosine 45? Now what I'm doing is multiplication. I get a totally different answer. All right, so again, you got to be careful here. This is 11.3. That is our solution. So x equals 11.3. Now really all we've done is add one extra step. When you get to here, you don't need to rewrite this. Once you get to this, you can say x equals, and then I type that answer right there. Now just to show you, if we go back to this triangle, that's a 45, 45, 90. And we learned in the last lesson that in a 45, 45, 90, the ratio of sides is 1 to 1 to the square root of 2. And we have the leg, which is 8. That's this part of the ratio. How do you go to the hypotenuse? We multiply by square root of 2. And if I take 8 times the square root of 2, that is also my answer. And just to show you here, if I type 8 square root of 2, there it is, 11.3. So what I'm showing you with the trig, with trigonometry, sometimes there's more than one way to come up with an answer. And you might say, you know what, the ratio is a lot faster, and I agree with you. But the problem is that when you're dealing with right triangles, most of them are not going to be special right triangles. Most of the time, you're not dealing with 30 and 60 and 45. So number 5 here, circle the angle. 35 degrees, we're going to use that. The opposite length is blank. The hypotenuse is x, and the adjacent side is 12. Okay, now adjacent hypotenuse is cosine. So cosine 35 degrees equals, it's the adjacent on top divided by the hypotenuse. So this is like the last example. We're going to put that over 1. Cross multiply. The x multiplies cosine 35 degrees equals 1 times 12 is 12. Now we have to move cosine 35. So to undo multiplication, we have to divide both sides by that. And now we get 12 divided by cosine 35. And we get 14.6. And that's the answer. Now, you might be asking, well, I know 35. Couldn't I also find this missing angle? Because we know that in any triangle, they add up to 180. And the answer is, yeah, we could. If you add these up and subtract from 180, this would be 55. If I had decided to use 55, then my opposite length would have been the 12. The hypotenuse would have still been x, But if I was using this angle, opposite hypotenuse would have been a sine problem. So I would have done sine 55 degrees equals 12, opposite over hypotenuse. And if I solve that, x times the sine of 55 is equal to 12. 1 times 12 is 12. Divide by sine 55. Does that give me the same answer? Let's see. 12 divided by sine 55. Yeah, so you get the same answer. So again, there's more than one way that you can do these. It's easiest just to take the first angle that you see, the first acute angle. Don't use the 90. All right, that's the end of part 2.